Okay, so good morning. Oh my gosh, what a day. Anyway, we're going to talk about Scandinavia and Eastern Europe. And this for me has been, I must say, quite a discovery. This is a brand new class that fits in really well with the rest, but I had not addressed it because it's difficult to get information. So you well, as I mentioned before, I give you a disclaimer right away. I don't speak neither Swedish, Danish, nor Norwegian, and I don't speak Czech or Hungarian, and so I'm Russian. I can deal with the pronunciation, but the rest you'll have to forgive me. Polish, same thing. So anyhow, I made some quite interesting discovery going through that. I try to make summaries as I usually do about the history of at least the period. And prior to doing that, I'm going to give you a reminder of what Rococo was about. And Rococo is only one of the styles of the 18th century, but it's the most typical. It is the prolongation of the Baroque period, started in France and almost simultaneously in Italy. And in France, it really started at the death of Louis XIV, when the court came back from Versailles to Paris, where they had smaller facilities because of the size of the city. And so the decoration completely changed from rather in your face, the Baroque with the very bright and saturated colors and a lot of columns and gilded place. You now have an exuberant decoration with curves and counter curves and undulation and a lot of elements modeled on nature, such as shells. You have acanthus leaves as well as others, a bouquet of flowers, fruits, music instruments, and also an opening towards the eastern countries and Far East particularly. So we'll have what we call chinoiserie, and we've seen a few, and we'll see just a little bit here with pagodas and dragons, monkeys, bizarre flowers, and people. It's highly theatrical. Now, on the other hand, the exterior of the Rococo churches are often very simple, and then you come in and it's you just taken by the interiors. It's totally dominated by the ornamentation. The floor plans are also more complex than what the Baroque were, and very often you have interlocking ovals. In palaces, the grand stairways become a centerpiece and offer different points of view of the decoration. Very often, the paintings are integrated, which means you have a, a painting and then will have very sophisticated frames around it with molded stucco and wood carving and pretending sometimes to be framed, and it's not, it's the painting. So you have very illusionistic ceiling paintings that when you enter the room, you're looking up at the sky when you have cherubs and other figures gazing down at you. The materials, as I mentioned before, included stucco, either painted or left white, very often white, and then combination of different colored wood, oak, beech, or walnut, some precious wood too, lacquered wood in the Japanese style, ornament of gilded bronze, and marble tops of commodes and tables. So this is just a reminder. And let's look now at Scandinavia. And actually, when we talk about Scandinavia, we normally should include only Norway, Sweden, and Denmark. Finland is typically not included in it, though nowadays they are included. Most of the time you include Finland into Scandinavia. This is a modern map, of course. And what we'll find is most of the battle wars that existed included that location here from between Denmark and Sweden and actually Germany, because the ships that wanted to go to the Baltic Sea and be in touch with Russia, for example, or the Baltic states, had to go through that strait between Denmark and Sweden. So we'll see how, hopefully summarized enough, how this is going to go back and forth. So let's talk about Denmark at first. First of all, I'm going back a little further. In between 1397 and 1523, sorry, there was a union in Scandinavia that was agreed at the Kalmar, Sweden. They joined under a single monarch the three kingdoms of Denmark, Sweden, and Norway. At that time, Finland belonged to Sweden, together with Norway's overseas colonies. And that, as you know, you have Iceland and Greenland, but there are also other territories we'll see in a minute. Sorry. The problems with direct. Anyway, as we're looking at what is influencing the 18th century, in 1536, Denmark and Norway are going to become officially Lutheran. And this is, of course, come from the influence of Germany when, remember, in 1519, we have the thesis by Luther. Between 1568 and 1648, you have the 8 Years' War that includes most of Europe. But Denmark is going to benefit from that because a large number of skilled refugees are going to come from the Netherlands. Then you have two wars. I'm not going to go too much into that, but this is when the war of 1643 and then the second one in 1655. What happens is that you have that strait between Denmark and Sweden belonged at that time to Denmark, and they were forcing people to pay a toll every time they were navigating through that strait to go to the Baltic Sea, and they were pretty hefty. And so finally, the Netherlands, which were normally an ally of Denmark, decided to ally themselves with Sweden to stop that toll. And so this is going to go first between 1643 and 45, and then again in 1655 and 60. So where the territories are going to go one side and then the other. But we'll see that after the Treaty of Copenhagen, that marks the conclusion of the Second Northern War, you will come now to the boundaries of Denmark as you now know. So we'll see a map in a minute. One of the important monarchs is King Frederick III. This is in the 17th century, but he is important for us because he instituted absolute monarchy in Denmark and Norway. And then we have Christian V, also at the end of the 17th century. After that, you have a succession of small kings that are not as important. But here's the map, and I think you will see what I mean. So that strays here, this is really where the ships were going. At that time, early on, before 1645, all that territory in red belonged to Denmark. After the First War, that territory became controlled by both Sweden and Denmark. They were fighting over it. Gotland went to Sweden. And then after 1660, that whole part is going to become Swedish and is very much the way we now know here Sweden, and in white you have Denmark. The only island that belongs to them is still Rhön, is the one that you see there. Just also a reminder, these are the colonial possession of the Kingdom of Denmark and Norway. Denmark and Norway remained one unit until the 19th century. And so you have here, of course, Norway, Denmark down here, and then you have Iceland and Greenland, and then other part, as well as the little dots that you see here in Africa, along the coast of India. All these are trading posts and some islands, part of the Sumatra. And I'm sorry, also some territories here closer to us. So let's look at Copenhagen. And I just found out while doing that presentation that in fact, all these countries are very often not as well described on internet than many others. And so I had to search quite a lot. But one of the main monuments that was built in the 18th century in Copenhagen is Amalienborg, which is the residential square in Copenhagen, quite a special building, as you can see in the next image. It's actually made of 4 residences. And these are, one of them is used by the royal family, and the other one often the crown prince. So as you can see, this is along the water and offers a particularly nice view. This was built during the reign of King Frederick V. You have so the 4 mentions. The architect was Nikolai Eightvedt. And again, I apologize for my pronunciation. But what happens is that prior to that, the royal family lived in the Christianborg castle, but the castle went up on fire in 1794, and so they moved to Amalienborg later on. Just across from the water is the church by the same architect, Frederick's Church, also known as a marble church. Quite an interesting building because it was designated and was supposed to be made all of marble. But the foundation that was set, the foundation stone was set in 1749. But then there were budget cuts, and then the death of the architect. Then the plans were abandoned, and the church was left incomplete, was then sold to Carl Friedrich Dichten for a rather ridiculous amount of money. And it was asked as a condition that he would build the church in the style similar to the original plan, but with far less costly material. And so it ended up being done in limestone. But it's a very beautiful church. As you see, the dome is definitely inspired at that time, probably by St. Paul Cathedral or other very large dome. Here's the interior. The Dane Mansion is one of 2 mirror image town mansions that belong to, one was a Dane, Frederick Ludwig von Dane, and the other one, the Count Johann Achtwig. And they had committed themselves to build the 2 identical town mansion that are pretty close to the Amalienborg. And so this was part of a whole plan for the center of the city. This is a rather late Baroque, Rococo style, Rococo, because you can see all these decoration around the windows as well as the top of the capitals. But as you can see, Rococo there is a very tamed Rococo. Probably not only because of the cost for a very expensive building, but often Rococo, as we said, from the outside is rather tame, but it's once you go into the inside. Most of these places have been changed dramatically, and so you don't have anymore the Rococo inside. And then we have the Prince Mansion. built in 1684 by Edinger. It was sold to King Frederick IV, who transformed it in a residence for the crown prince. And that's, of course, prior to Amalienborg. The crown prince then completely altered the building from 43 to 44 with the assistance of the master builder, Eightvet, that we had seen previously. It now houses the National Museum of Denmark. And then another one is the Old Fellow Mansion. This is also a Rococo building, very pretty. The color of the stone is always very pretty, very ornamented gates, grids at the entrance. It was named after the local branch of the Independent Order of Odd Fellows, who acquired the building in 1900. It now houses a concert hall, which is open to the public. Moving to Norway, just a few points that are important. As I say, they were managed by Denmark until 1814, when they were ceded to Sweden. But what is quite interesting is the immigration to North America started in 1825. With the first mass immigration commencing in the 1860s. And I had not realized to what point, but by 1930, 800,000 people had emigrated, the majority settling, as we know, in the Midwestern United States. So finally, on the 7th June of 1905, this is just to keep you current, there was the dissolution of the Union. And they called on the Prince Carl of Denmark to become king as Haakon VII. The modern king, is Harald V, who is reigning since 1991. Some of the 18th century building is that, and I'm not going to pronounce it, but in Trondheim, I think it's a Stiftsgarden, probably something like this. Is the royal residence, and it's situated on one of the most important thoroughfares of the city. It had 140 rooms. And what is interesting, this is all made of wood. It's the largest wooden building in Northern Europe. Had been used by royalty and their guests since 1800. We have no idea who the architects are, but this is more representative of the domestic architecture that you find in Norway. A few very pretty buildings. This is in Bergen, Damsgård, or again, I'm not sure what I'm saying, but very pretty, very elegant, which denotates very much the Rococo style, and then a very pretty garden. Here you can see, and it seems almost to have a mixture of wood and stone. I'm not sure of that. Yeah, actually, yes, it is a mixture of both. Moving to Sweden, there for economical reason and probably a more stable regime in a sense, you find quite a bit of 18th century building. We see that during the 17th century, as we know, after winning wars against Denmark, Russia, Poland, and Sweden at that time emerged as a great power because they took direct control of the Baltic region, which was Europe's main source of grain, iron, copper, timber, tar, hemp, and furs. It is during the reign of Gustav II Adolf that Sweden comes up as a great European power. He will be followed about 50 years later by an interesting figure. So there are, of course, kings between Gustav and Christina. Christina will become queen, and I'm just mentioning, if you want to go and look on Wikipedia, she's an interesting character who will reign for a short period of time, 32 to 54. And of course, she wasn't queen in 32 as she was born in 26, but closer to the early 40s. And in 54, she decided to abdicate and move to Italy. And she spent the rest of her life, about 35 years, in Rome. So a whole series of popes, where she was very known and sometimes feared by the Pope, because she had her particular character. We know that she knew some of the great artists, and she was a supporter of the arts in Rome and of literature. So we move to 18th century monarch. This is Karl the 12th, who died in 1718, and his wife Eleonora is going to succeed him. She will be queen from 1718 until 20, when she will abdicate in favor of her husband, King Frederick. And at that time, they will relinquish the absolute power. Then we have some other kings that we will talk about within the architecture. Frederick I, who covered until the mid, this is actually King Frederick I, who is going to be king until 51, and be succeeded by Adolf Frederick, we have a change of dynasty. The others were Wittelsbach, and starting with Adolf Frederick, we are talking about the House of Holstein, which is just in the south of Denmark, by the way. And then Gustav III, who is going to cover until the end of the century. So just to give you an idea of the geography, here we have what Sweden will be. As you can see, it has absorbed Finland at that time. And then we have a different acquisition, and this is about the way it ends up. This is that was a vital part of Sweden that belonged to Denmark and was relinquished at the time for the control of the strait to the Baltic Sea. So moving to Stockholm, he has a very large and imposing royal palace that was designed by Nicodemus Tesson the Younger, and then at his death by Karl Herleman. This is not the place where the family lives, but this is the administrative palace of Stockholm. The interior was very Rococo. The outside is extremely Baroque, almost, I would say, goes through the centuries, because you can find some Renaissance part to the design too. But of course, inside, it started with being Rococo and then was modified along the centuries. Another view. You can see how huge the place is. And then I could only find these two pictures of the inside. You can see this is not very Rococo, rather Baroque, the top of the west stairwell. And then the White Sea Ballroom, very pretty room, a little more Rococo, though it's not nothing to do with the French or the Italian Rococo. The state apartments. We're moving towards neoclassical. If you can see the decoration of the interior of the windows there, and then the whole estate, the throne room is kind of a mixture of style going from neoclassical with some Baroque details. In fact, the royal family lives in the Drottningholm Palace. That is just at the edge of one of the islands that make the south of, just south of Stockholm. So this is a much nicer place, much more livable. Actually, part of it is a museum and can be visited by the public. It enjoys some beautiful Italian gardens at the back. That was originally built in the late 16th century and served as a summer residence of the Swedish royal court for most of the 18th century. But the now royal family lives there. And they used actually the West Wing as their primary residence. Inside, you have a beautiful library. And then I brought in the porcelain room, beautiful blue and white, just mimicking the colors of the Chinese porcelain of the time, Ming and others. It has in its very large park some of the small buildings like a theater, which is now, that's the second theater. The first one was built by Queen Ulrika, but as often it was damaged by fire and then was rebuilt very shortly afterwards. And now there are some troops coming and playing, and it's open to the public. You can see the interior, very homey type of interior. And other buildings within the park, the Chinese Pavilion, as I said, this is something you find in Germany, in Austria, in almost that whole part of Europe. You have that building where people would have having a smaller place for a little intimate dinner. Here is the interior, and then you can see the green salon also within that pavilion. The gardens are quite nice. Some of it is a Baroque garden, rather formal, but then towards the end, it changes towards an English garden, which also became quite fashionable and less formal for people, where they could walk within the trees. And so very pretty place. Two more of the small buildings within the park, Confidenzen, which would probably be kind of a tea house where they could go and have a tea and be away from the court. And here the silver Kammern, so the place where they stored the silvers. The building is very much more Rococo, very pretty from the outside. This is another of the summer palace. This is in the province of Södermanland, south of Stockholm, built in the 1720s. It offers a mixture of Rococo and what they call Gustavian and Victorian styles, which were some modification later on. The interior design is regarded as one of the most beautiful in Sweden. The palace has been mostly associated with Gustav V and Queen Victoria, who spent their summers here at the end of the 19th century. It's very popular place among the Swedish royalty. So inside we have these nice rooms, and we find again these beautiful heaters, and I went a little bit after the one on Austria and Germany, went into it and found out that their name in Germany is Kachelofen, and that the outside doesn't mistake you, but actually the inside is quite interesting because it's a maze of chambers where the gas can go around and really take advantage of the whole surface of these tiles, which are special tiles, radiating tiles that make these very efficient heating places also diminished by the way the gases go all around before being going out to the chimney, less polluting than the previous ones. So here you can see two, one in the red atrium and the one in the blue cabinet. The fuel, by the way, was usually wood. And the whole system is apparently goes back to the Neolithic period. So it's really based on a system that was invented very, very early on and has some variances. If you look at Russia or Germany or these countries, obviously these were influenced by Germany and Austria. The gardens are beautiful. Here you have biological ponds, so that's done in a way that benefits nature. And then the English garden with the little bridges and lovely place to stroll around the park. Some churches, this is the Katharina Kirche, the church in Södermalm. And you can see the very pretty, I love this ochre and white or off-white contrast, a very pretty tower and finials, so steeples, very typical of that region. And then inside a very modern crucifixion, as you can see, and altar that correspond to have been, of course, changed with the centuries. The church, by the way, burned in 1990. Just the external walls remained, and so this explains the interior that is much more modern. I'm jumping up. So Finland, and we certainly have a lot of text, but we have to explain what happens, is that during the Middle Age, Finland gradually became part of the Kingdom of Sweden and the sphere of influence of the Catholic Church. The Finnish upper class lost its position and lands to the new Swedish and German nobility and to the Catholic Church. In the 17th and 18th century, it was clear that Finland was a conquered country. The Finns, locals, were portrayed to be primitive and their language inferior. Swedish became the dominant language of the nobility, administration, and education. And Finnish was chiefly a language for peasantry, clergy, and local courts. Really interesting. I knew a young man who was Turkish and who couldn't believe when he talked to the distributor in Finland that he could understand many words. And there are some links between the Turkish language and the Finnish language. During the Protestant Reformation, the Finns gradually converted to Lutheranism. In the 18th century, towards between Sweden and Russia, ended up with the occupation of Finland by the Russian forces. These were the Greater Wrath and the Lesser Wrath. And unfortunately, an entire generation of young men was lost during the Great Wrath due to mainly the destruction of homes and farms and to the burning of Helsinki. I tell you, the history we now know might be puzzling, but nothing compared to what happened before. Beautiful architecture, very typically finish, nothing to do with the rest, but this is a typical architecture that you find in the 18th century of particularly churches. This is the Tornio block pillar church. As you know, they have a lot of snow, so they have to have a very steep roof to make sure it doesn't stay on. But I love the contrast of the wooden roof tiles and the white. Sorry, again. This is, and I'm not going to try to pronounce, this is an old church dating back to 1765. Actually, the tower that you have on the left was finished later. In the beginning of the 19th century. But here's the interior, as you can see, all wood and a lovely little pew. Not pew, pulpit. And then one more, the Lappi Church. Also with these multiple roof lines, I think it's extremely elegant. And then the rest of the structure is made of wood. And here's the Homa Town Hall, lovely little town hall again with that beautiful ochre. These are these natural colors that you find in these countries without having to go to chemical places. These ochres are extremely pretty and warm, and you can see that this is summer, just a few days of summer. Okay, moving to one of the Baltic states is the only one where I could find one thing belonging to the 18th century, Latvia. So again, we have these Baltic states that are here, and they suffered. Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania struggled between Sweden, Poland, and Russia. So just one point, Livona, which doesn't exist anymore, it was composed of northern Latvia and southern Estonia, fell under the Polish and Lithuanian rule between 58 and 1583. And then, so here you have in dark red the borders in the 18th century, which are going to revert to this. And I'm going to move my little window on the other side so you can see, and Estonia. So there are some dramatic changes, and this is a modern map, gives you an idea. Lithuania, together with Poland, became the huge territory that went almost to the Black Sea, and is now a really small country next to Belarus. And then you have that little Russian enclave there. In the 17th and early 18th century, the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, Sweden and Russia struggled for supremacy in the Eastern Baltic. So they poor people found themselves really battled between all these big powers. And a lot of people, a lot of the population, by the way, was taken away for forced labor in Russia. Several important cultural changes occurred during this time. Western Latvia adopted Lutheranism as its main religion. The ancient tribe that were making up that territory assimilated to form the Latvian people, speaking on one Latvian language. They were largely isolated from the rest of Latvia, and the southern part that was isolated from the rest of Latvia, adopted Catholicism under Polish and Jesuit influence. So you have two, you have the Lutheran and the Polish and Jesuit, and most of them really rejected completely Calvinism. One palace that I found in Latvia that was designed by Bartolomeo Rastrelli. He's the same architect who we will see once we go to Russia, that made most of the palaces in St. Petersburg. This is the Rondale Palace, built between 1736 and 67. A very pretty structure, considered one of the prettiest palace around that region. It suffered, unfortunately, serious damages in 1919 during the Latvian War of Independence. It was partially burned, and then the palace became the property of the Ministry of Agriculture, and some of the premises were occupied by the local school. Then it was reconstructed as flats for the Latvian military veterans. Then finally, it was taken over by the Ministry of Education and officially reconstructed for use as a school. And it is now a museum since 1972. And inside you have the throne room, and then some other often beautiful one tiles there. That must have been quite warming up for the bedroom, the Duke's sleeping bedroom. Going west and south, we're moving to Poland. Again, coming back to what we just said, the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth that was signed in 1569 lasted until 1795. And so this became a federal state, more closely unified than the earlier political arrangement between Poland and Lithuania. The most populous urban center, the capital city of Warsaw, replaced Danzig, known as Gdansk, as the leading trade center. In 1697, at that time, the kings were elected. They didn't have the normal automatic succession. Brought Augustus II the Strong from the house of Wettin to the Polish throne. And the only thing he had to do to become king of Poland was to convert to Roman Catholicism. He was succeeded by his son, August III, that reigned between 1734 and 63. And then we have another election that results in the elevation of Stanislaw August Poniatowski, who became Stanislas II August. Poniatowski is a very known name, one of the old nobility in Poland, but was also quite a familiar figure around the court of Catherine II of Russia. Is known to be one of her numerous lovers. And then in 1772, part of the Commonwealth were divided up among Prussia, Austria, and Russia. So I'm leaving it there because this is not a history class, but to understand the 18th century architecture in Poland, and particularly in Warsaw, we have to understand that Warsaw was completely burned down by the German at the end of the Second World War. This is what you consider a sea of rubble. Over 85% of the buildings in Warsaw were destroyed by the end of World War II, including the Old Town and the Royal Castle. And this was because the German wanted to punish the Poles for their revolt. So the few castles, I mean, there were an enormous amount of palaces around Warsaw. All you see is reconstruction, and the same thing with the churches. So here is the Church of St. Joseph of the Visitationist, was built between 1664 and 1761, and with a very pretty, well-restored interior, all in white with some gilding. By the way, the library and the museum collections were taken to Germany, of course, before burning it. The claim to fame of that church is that Frédéric Chopin used to play the church organ here, mainly during services to school children. The Brannicky, again, I'm so sorry, but my mouse seems to go too fast. Barthelmen van Gameren, the Shapski Palace, sorry again, Shapski Palace, very difficult to say, was designed for the Archbishop of Warsaw. It was built between 1712 and 21 and was reconstructed in 1733 when it was purchased by a gentleman who offered it as a dowry to his daughter. The palace changed owners at least 10 times. It was again destroyed in the year 39 and reconstructed between 48 and 59. Brannicky Palace or Brannicky Palace, 1740-50, again, all these were raised. So this is reconstructed very faithfully with the beautiful coloring of the stone and the walls. You can see what was left of the palace in Warsaw in 1945. And next to it, some of these so useful paintings by Bernardo Bellotto, who represented them in some of his cityscape that he did in the 18th century, that Italian painter that went all around Eastern Europe. And fortunately for his works, a lot was reconstructed according to what he was showing. The Palace of the Four Winds, built about 1680, probably to Tilman van Gameren's design for the high official and royal secretary Stanislaw Kleinpolt. It was then sold to different people. They changed hand again many times, including the bishop. Very pretty palace, again, completely reconstructed. In 1927, prior to the war, it was purchased by the Polish Treasury, restored, and it had become the seat of the Ministry of Labor and Social Welfare. It is now the Ministry of Health. And the Sapieha Palace, commissioned by the Chancellor of the Grand Duchy of Lithuania, was built between 1731 and 46, constructed as a French-style city palace, as we called an hôtel particulier in French, and consisted of 5 axial main buildings with the corps de logis and 2 outbuildings. It was converted in the early 19th century for the use of, as barracks for the use of the army. It was destroyed again in 1944 and was rebuilt in 1950s by one of the Polish defenders, if we can say. Really pretty building. Bohemia, which is now part of the Czech Republic, in its history, saw again a whole changing of hands. So in 1526, Louis II, King of Hungary and Bohemia, was the last king of the house of, and I don't want to pronounce it, fell at the battles of Mohacs. His brother-in-law, Ferdinand of Austria, brother of Charles V, was elected king, and he became Emperor of Austria at that time and the Holy Roman Emperor later on. And so it is with him that began the Austrian House of Bohemia, elected until 1547, and then became hereditary until 1918. As we know, it is also, Prague became at the time, with the quite interesting character, and I'm trying to remember his name. It will come back, but it became actually the capital of the Holy Roman Empire. Some of the buildings in Prague, as we know, Prague is an extraordinary city, but mostly we would say Baroque buildings. But in the 18th century, we see also some pretty churches. This is St. Nicholas Church, built between 1704 and 55, on the site of formerly of a Gothic church. It was dedicated to St. Nicholas. And it's one of the typical, one of the most beautiful Baroque style building, though it is built in the 18th century. Here's the front entrance with the undulating facade, very typical of what you find in Rome with the Guarino Guarini and some of the Borromini. Not a flat facade, but just articulated. And then the exuberant inside is very, very much Baroque, Rococo type of decoration. The interior of the dome, and the ceiling fresco depicting the apotheosis of St. Nicholas on the right. So this is very much influenced by the Italian Baroque, and Rococo by some of the finesse of its decoration. Another church, the Basilica of the Assumption in the Stroganoff Monastery. Inside, it's more Baroque, though the paintings on the ceiling are much more Rococo. So we have to keep in mind that these are built at the time of the Baroque and then decorated later on, and once it is finished. The church was completed in Rococo forms between 1751 and 56 by an Italian artist. Part of the monastery, so the church, you have that extraordinary theological hall, which is the library dedicated to theological works. The stucco decoration and paintings date from the 1720s. Just next to Bohemia, what is now Slovakia, don't forget it used to be Czechoslovakia, but after the conquest of Buda in 1541 by the Ottomans, Pressburg, the modern-day capital of Slovakia, Bratislava, became, for the period between 1536 and 1784, the capital in the coronation cities of the Habsburg Kingdom of Hungary. So between 1526 to 1830, 19 Habsburg sovereigns went through coronation ceremonies as kings and queens of the Kingdom of Hungary in the St. Martin's Cathedral. After the ousting of the Ottomans from Budin, which later became Budapest in 1686, it became the capital of the Habsburg Kingdom of Hungary. Despite living under Hungarian, Habsburg, and Ottoman administration for several centuries, the Slovak people succeeded in keeping their language and their culture. And it is during the 18th century that the Slovak national movement emerged, partially inspired by the broader pan-Slavic movement with the aim of fostering a sense of national identity among the Slovak people. And we know how that is going to end up. So a few beautiful buildings we have in Bratislava. The Episcopal Summer Palace was originally built in the 17th century was the seat of the Archbishop until it was occupied by the Ottoman Empire in 1543. And then finally they rebuilt it as a Baroque building. It is now housing the government of Slovakia. The Ghazalkovich Palace, finished in 1760 by the architect Anton Meyerhofer for an aristocrat, a Hungarian aristocrat, who was a close friend of Maria Theresa, the Empress. It became a center of Baroque musical life. Joseph Haydn premiered some of his works there. And actually, the Prince Esterhazy used to lend him his favorite conductor, who was Haydn, and he played there quite often. Following the restoration, the palace became the residence of the Slovakia president in 1996. This is the Mirbach Palace, Rococo style again, built from 1768 to 1770 for the brewer Michael Speck. The name comes from the last owner, the Count Emil Mirbach, who was shot in 1945 by the invading Russian. The palace was at that time expropriated, and with the art collection of Mirbach. The palace was then completely renovated in 1975 and is now the seat of the Bratislava City Gallery. A lovely little house, really just at the corner of one of the meandering streets of Bratislava, is the house of the Good Shepherd. This is in the old town, just below the Bratislava Castle. It was built between 1760 and 65 by a Bratislava master mason, Matej Olring. Now, the house is home to the Museum of Clocks, which exhibits antique clocks. It's really one of the most beautiful Rococo-style buildings in Central Europe. Okay, I'm going to take a little break here before we go to Hungary. So you can unmute yourself. I'm going to put you here in a little mark. So if you want to unmute yourself and ask me questions, I'll try to answer. I can't promise because this is really not one of my strong points, but I think I've been able to show you already some pretty places. So unmute yourself if you want to ask me questions.
And if I'm in.
Yes, John.
Just a comment. I noticed in the northern architecture, I mean, they were kind of a big boxes.
Yes.
And kind of a straight lines. And as you start moving towards the Central Europe and Western, the architecture become more, as you said, exuberant. I mean, the Rococo becomes more ornamented. Is there anything in the, and also in the northern, there is you showed very little about the churches. Is there anything in the culture that explains this preference for this block type of construction, or this?
I think it was a lack of funds, a lack of money very often. As soon as you come with ornamentation, you need to have the very specialized craftsmen to do it. And so most probably they didn't have them around. So they could do a certain architecture, but they didn't have all the artists that were specialists in these stucco works, which is very different. When you come closer to Austria, the artisans are in Vienna or can come from Italy much easier. But going to Scandinavia was not the same thing. So you have architects, and so as you say, they often just like blocks. The architecture is almost universal. You can't really say that it's Baroque or it is Rococo, for sure not. But I think it's a lack of artisan, of craftsmen that would be able to do that. And in places like Norway, very little money, because they were always dependent until the 20th century. They were dependent on other, Denmark or Sweden or etc. And so they were number two. So you didn't have, the rich people were not especially going to Norway. They would stay close to where the money was, which was the capital. So that's often the case. You have the same happening, for example, in the Netherlands compared to Belgium, when they were one country or one region. The Netherlands was always a much simpler style, even in painting, because they were far away from the court. But if you go to Bruges or to Ghent or to Brussels, then everything becomes far more sophisticated, because the very good artists remain there. Any other?
Yes. You said that 800,000 people migrated from Norway in the 1930s. Why was that?
Probably because the country, was struggling with. They don't have a lot of natural resources. The climate is difficult. I have a friend who adores Norway, and I think Norway has made giant steps now to rejoin, the quality of life that you find in Sweden and in Denmark. But at that time, they were struggling. They had been through. They always were number two, number 2 or 3. And so they saw the fact that going to, it's that the Golden Pass in the US, they thought they could do much better there. I've never been to Norway. I've been to Oslo once when I was traveling, but just stayed for very little time. And but I have a friend who lived there who adores it. So it's really difficult. As I say, I'm not very familiar with all these places. I just wanted to show you some highlight, because we never talk about these places, and I think it's important to understand a little bit. No other questions? You're all tired. But
it's a miracle so much was reconstructed after the war.
Pardon, Bill?
I said the reconstruction that was required after the war is unbelievable.
Unbelievable. When I saw that picture of Warsaw.
Oh, terrible. Oh.
It's incredible. And that, the Russians were on their way, and the Poles revolted, and the Germans said, oh, you do it that way. And very shortly after that, they were kicked out. But it's horrible. And that's why, you see, there are many more palaces in Warsaw than what I showed you, but they all reconstructed. So I just wanted to give you an idea, because I'm showing you actually a lot of works. But it's for you, it's just to have an idea. It's just like that beautiful palace in Latvia, and these Baltic states also went through so much. So quite interesting. I discovered a lot in preparing this class. Sometimes I was over my head, because it's so intricate. One year they do this, the second year they come back and, But Jan, what I liked was what I found about these stoves that you like so much.
Thank you.
These are in English are called cockle stove. Cockle stove.
Holstone.
And the cockle stoves, they are considered extremely efficient for the time, because you had these radiating tiles that they were made of, and then covered with ceramic, which helped the radiation too. And they're very pretty at the same time.
Did they put the wood right in the bottom of each one of those stoves?
Or you have that door, and they would put the logs into it. Yeah.
Beautiful.
But they're so decorative. I think they're incredible.
Beautiful.
Okay, so I don't know if everybody is back. Come back, come back. We're going to start again. And moving to Hungary, I'm going to mute you all. And we'll talk at the end. So moving to Hungary, again, this is one of these countries that has these elastic borders that go big and smaller. And of course, Hungary spent a lot of time under the ruling of Austria. So 2 years after the unsuccessful Battle of Buda, a renewed European campaign reconquered Buda in 1686. In 1718, the entire kingdom of Hungary was removed from Ottoman rule, which unfortunately caused an enormous loss in demography. So a lot of people were killed after that period. Also, a lot of people had been sent to Turkey to work. Between 1604 and 1711, there are many anti-Habsburg uprisings because of the Austrian rule and also the restriction on non-Catholic Christian denomination. As you have seen, Lutheranism had taken over quite a bit of these countries, but with the Habsburg, they were really restricting the religious freedom to almost only Catholic. In the 18th century, the main Hungarian political representatives asserted themselves as the main defenders of Mary Theresa, the Empress of Austria. And then just to show you a positive side in Hungary, in 1782, Budapest University of Technology and Economics was founded. This is the oldest university of technology in the world. And a lot of people came there just for that, and then it was reproduced in other countries. So I'm going to show you a few places, and mostly what we find is these extraordinary palaces belong to the big names, such as the Esterházy. So this is the summer residence of the Esterházy family, called Esterháza, was built by the Johann Ferdinand Möldhammer, and at his death the work was continued by a Hungarian architect, Melchior Heffler. Here is the inner courtyard, which I think is absolutely superb, with a beautiful two-level staircase, really beautifully articulated. It is called, by the way, the Hungarian Versailles. From 1766 to 1790, the estate was the home of the celebrated composer Joseph Haydn. He lived in a 4-room flat in the large 2-story building housing servants' quarters. So it must have been these side places. Esterházy also had 2 opera houses. The main theater seating 400. This one was destroyed by fire in 1779, as well as a marionette puppet theater. Haydn would conduct his own operas as well as others, and often with more than 100 performances a year. This was a rather isolated location, by the way. Beautiful interior, very Rococo there. We know we are now much closer to Austria and the important power centers. So we do have artists that are available to decorate. This is the banquet room. Another interior with a Kastelhofen, as you can see again. The Royal Palace of Godola, I think that's about the pronunciation, is located 20 kilometers east of Budapest. It was the favorite place of King Francis Joseph, Queen Elizabeth, Sissi, and later the regent. This is one of the largest monuments of Hungarian palace architecture. The construction of the palace began around 1733 by a builder, famous builder from Salzburg. Unfortunately, after the Second World War, the abuses generally led to the deterioration of the building for almost a half century. And fortunately, in the recent year, it regained its late splendor with a complete refurbishment. The Bishop Palace, and I'm not going to even try to tell you of the place, but again, absolutely beautiful building, very Baroque when you look at the construction. Some additional decoration there put it in the Baroque, in the end of the Baroque period. But again, most of the interior has been changed, so nothing I can show you. The Cathedral and the Bishop Palace of Zambatheli, and I'm not sure again of the pronunciation, where you have a depiction of saints. The church of the palace is on the side, and really inspired when you see the Pietra Serena, so that contrast with the gray, blue-gray stone around the windows, and then the lighter color of the facade with the piers painted in slightly contrasting color. And of course, now we move into Russia. Just a view of the Romanov dynasty, and I put together something so that you could understand what we're going to. We are in the 18th century, looking at the first big name is, of course, Peter the Great, that reigned until 1725. When he died, it is his wife who became the ruler, but just for a small period of time, between 25 and 27. And then the power went to Peter II, who was Peter's grandson, from 27 to 30, so for a short period of time, moved to Anna, who was a niece of Peter, for about 10 years. The Tsarina Anna went to Ivan, who was a nephew of Anna, from 1740 to 41, and then moved back to the Peter's descendants with Elizabeth, who was a very appreciated Tsarina. between 1741 and 1762. When she died, she was succeeded by Peter III, but it took the name of Peter III in 1762, who was very quickly replaced by his own wife, who was an Anhalt-Zerbst princess named Sophia, and who took the name of Catherine II when she became Tsarina, when she did the coup. And she was, of course, an extremely influential character between 62 and 96. So for us, the most important figures are Peter I, Elizabeth, and Catherine II. So let's look a little bit more in detail. Peter the Great, of course, incredible personality who really started modernizing the country, brought the centralized autocracy into Russia, and played a major role in bringing his country into the European state system. He reformed the Russian army and created the Russian Navy. He also, that whole emphasis on the army was particularly to regain control of the Ottoman Turks. Between 1721, he made a secret alliance with the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth and Denmark against Sweden, resulting in the Great Northern War. So this is what we talked about, is that problem always of these territories between Sweden and Denmark. He acquired 4 provinces situated south and east of the Gulf of Finland, and securing his coveted access to the sea. He really wanted that access to the Baltic Sea, and this is how he did it. And very quickly, immediately, he started building St. Petersburg. In 1721, the Russian stardom officially became the Russian Empire. He reorganized his government based on the latest Western model, molding Russia into an absolutist state. And of course, we know he's looking at Louis XIV. Elizabeth Petrovna is really an interesting figure, though we don't very often talk about her. She continued the age of enlightenment in Russia. She was very much for education. Her domestic policies really made the University of Moscow the highest ranking Russian educational institution. Her court became one of the most splendid in all of Europe, especially regarding architecture. So she's going to be the one that's going to start most of the building that we know and often attribute to Catherine. She allowed the nobles to gain dominance in local government while shortening their terms of service to the state, encouraged the foundation of the different art institutes. She modernized Russia's roads. She encouraged the foundation of the Imperial Academy of Art. Sorry, I have a double thing there. She financed grandiose Baroque projects of her favorite architect, who is the architect we saw already in Latvia, Bartolomeo Rastrelli, an Italian, and who designed the Peterhof Palace, the Winter Palace, the Smolny Cathedral. During her lifetime, there were 2 major European conflicts, the War of Austrian Succession and the 7 Years' War. And then finally, Catherine II the Great, that ruled between 1762 and 96. I'm not going to go how she came to power. It's a very interesting story, and I think you ought to go, if you're not familiar with it, go on the net and try to understand a little more about her. She also supported the ideals of the Enlightenment, had a lot of correspondence with philosophers and writers and other important figures in Europe, particularly in France. So she really earned the status of enlightened despot, because she was still an absolute power. She patronized the arts, science, and learning. She extended the borders by about 200,000 square miles, absorbing New Russia, Crimea, Northern Caucasus, the right bank of Ukraine, Belarus, Lithuania, and Courland. She nationalized all the church lands to help pay for her wars. And of course, the church was so powerful. These, as you find in most of Europe, all the monasteries around had tremendous lands around the country. And so that was a way for her to pay her wars. However, she promoted Christianity in her anti-Ottoman policy. But remained very much, though for her, she was originally a Protestant lady, a Lutheran woman, being German, but she converted to the Orthodox religion and was quite a supporter of it. She separated the Jews from Orthodox society, restricting them to the Pale of Settlement. So they were already starting to hoard the Jews in particular location. And just to show you, she changed for the time of her coronation. These were the traditional crowns for the Tsars. And starting 1762, this became the incredible, one of the most beautiful crown that was ever made in Europe. So let's look at some of these incredible palaces and churches, particularly in the region of St. Petersburg. Again, by Bartolomeo Rastrelli, we have the Winter Palace, seen from the Palace Square with its very typical kind of pale green, almost aqua color, and contrast with the white and the gilded capitals and the windows decoration. He is seen from the palace embankment. And here is an aerial view that shows you the extent of that incredible Winter Palace. In the interior, we have very little, because of course, the palace after the revolution was completely stripped of many of its beauties and was only restored, but differently later on. So most of the former grandeur of the interior are only visible by paintings. And so I'm showing you here just a painting here by Konstantin Ukhtomsky, showing the interior of the Winter Palace, the famous Jordan staircase. The Winter Palace was the official residence of the Russian emperors from 732 to 1917. It was severely damaged by fire and then rebuilt. And of course, as I mentioned, it was stormed in 1917 by the revolutionaries. Here is just one of the rooms with the Flemish, part of the Flemish collection of the Hermitage collection. Or very, very Rococo boudoir. The only thing that wouldn't be Rococo is the color. It's too dark for Rococo, but definitely the exuberant and very organic decoration around the panels is very Rococo. Not far from there is also by the same architect, by Rastrelli, is the Smolny convent that was commissioned by Elizabeth. Extraordinary again, choice of color, then blue and white and gold is very superb. It's on the left bank of the Neva. It consists of a cathedral and a complex of buildings planned as a convent. It was built to house Elizabeth, who was the daughter of Peter. And that's before she was supposed to become a nun. And but then because of the overthrow of Ivan VI, she decided against entering the monastic life and then accepted the offer of the Russian throne. Here is the facade of the church of the convent. And as we can't see the inside, here is the model of the Smolny convent open, giving an idea of the extraordinary inside of the church. And here is a reproduction of the entire convent. Another of the great churches in St. Petersburg is the St. Nicholas Naval Cathedral. So commissioned for St. Nicholas, but as a protector of the sailors. Golden domes and pale blue color. That's just the color is very Rococo, that kind of pastel colors. Beautiful orders with the Corinthian capitals, very ornamented windows with cherubs around. Here's an aerial view in the winter. And then inside, the incredible, it looks almost like a mosque, except you have Jesus at the top, but with these type of chandeliers are very similar to the ones you find in mosques. It's an incredibly large interior with the iconostasis there that separates the believers from the altar. And there is a lower church below that one that has other very color, emerald green color, that is also part of the palette of the Rococo. Outside of St. Petersburg is the famous Catherine's Palace in Tsarskoye Selo, now named Pushkin. That's unfortunately the place where the Tsar's family will be taken down during the revolution, at the beginning of the revolution. Extraordinary building again, these pale blues, gold and white, very typical, beautiful ornamentation. And this is a direct reproduction of what was happening, and even better, I would say, happening in Italy and in France. Here is the carriage courtyard. And inside, what you can see, again, probably going 10 times over what was existed in the Versailles, when you see that room, the ballroom, with all the chandeliers. So imagine that with candles, and then people with their extraordinary dresses and suits just dancing around. This is a more neoclassical part of the palace with arabesque. All these paintings are inspired by what had just been discovered in Herculaneum and Pompeii. And the Chinese Salon of Alexander I with two huge Karkaroff with Delft tiles, it looks like. And the chapel. You have a feeling that there's so much money that they were able to do and go overboard on what had been done in other places. Other palaces, this is the Vorontsov Palace at Sadovaya in St. Petersburg. Sorry, I go too fast there. That palace contains 50 rooms, was built by Francesco Bartolomeo Rastrelli, okay, the same for the Count Mikhail Illarionovich Vorontsov, who was the Chancellor of the Empress Elizabeth and who was a maternal relative by marriage. It took 8 years to build. Vorontsov was exiled a few years later and sold his main residence to the crown. So Paul I of Russia gave the palace to the Knights Hospitalier and became one of the buildings for that order. It has housed since a succession of exclusive military schools. And to the present, it's the Suvorov military school. Stroganoff Palace, also in St. Petersburg, commissioned by the Baron Sergei Stroganoff in 1752. From Rastrelli, again, he did an enormous amount of design around that region. It was pretty close to the Catherine's Palace. At that time, the Stroganoffs were the richest family in Russia and were related to the Empress by marriage. This is the Menshikov Palace in St. Petersburg. They had two huge residences. The one in St. Petersburg, and we'll see in a minute the one out in the countryside that is much more charming. This is probably the very formal part. It was the first stone building in the city and is now a public museum. It's a branch of the Hermitage. Belonging to the same family is the Grand Menshikov Palace in Lomonosov. As you can see, this is a kind of a summer residence. Very pretty with the curving lines of the corps de logis. It's in restoration, as you can see, but beautiful, formal Italian garden. This is the south facade facing the lawn. And then here is the Chinese palace in Oranienbaum. That was built part of the Peterstadt fortress on the bank of the Kahost River for the Grand Duke Peter Fedorovich. So that was built again by Rastrelli, who gave it that mix of Baroque architecture, classicism, and some Chinese motifs. Inside, you have some beautiful, again, wall decoration, very typical, but much lighter type of Baroque. This is the Lilac Salon and the Grand Salon of Chinese Pavilion. More palaces, the Mariinsky Palace in Kiev. So we're moving to the Ukraine. The Ukraine, slightly different in style. It's not the same architect. Oh, sorry, it is the same architect. It is by Rastrelli. I forgot to put it on. We find again the same beautiful pastel colors, striking facades. In the early 19th century, the palace burned down in a series of fires and was in total disrepair and abandoned for almost half a century. In 1870, Alexander II had the palace reconstructed using the old drawings. They reestablished the park on the south side of the palace, and this became the residence for visiting members of the imperial family. It became also, after the revolution, part of the buildings occupied by the revolutionaries, as you can imagine. Then a few more churches. This is the St. Clement's Church in Moscow, dedicated to Roman Pope St. Clement. 5-dome, 2-story church, built between 1762 and 1769. This is a very typical, what they call in Russia, the Elizabethan Baroque. So this, the Tsarin Elizabeth gave her own name to the style. We don't know who the architect is. Probably an Italian one. In King Giuseppe, I don't know very well, the St. Catherine Cathedral, very pretty. All these bulb-like finials are very pretty. And very often it's almost a central plan. In Kiev, another of the great churches is St. Andrew's Church, built in honor of St. Andrew, who is recognized as the Apostle Rus. It was, again, built under the Russian Empress Elizabeth, who wanted to construct a summer residence in that area and had that as her church. Here's a view on the onion bulb steeples. And then really interesting, that's the first time I see, this is an iconostasis, so it's the screen that separates the altar from the believers. But for once, it's not a Byzantine looking series of painting. These are very Rococo and Baroque type of painting. Only time I've seen that. And with the frame that are so Rococo, very organic. And the ceiling with the iconostasis on the side, view of the central dome. And I haven't even had the time to put the last slide announcing the next Thursday lecture, which is going to do with the Academy in England. I will send you the list of illustration that I haven't had time to send you. But so on February 11th, we'll have the Academy in England. That's on the Thursday series. On the Tuesday series, we exploring nature and human nature in the north. And this will be on February the 2nd. So let me stop the recording.